Welcome to AppStories, a weekly exploration of the world of apps. Today's show is brought to you by Linode. I'm John Voorhees, and with me, as always, is Federico Viticci. Hey, Federico.
Hello, John. Happy anniversary.
Thank you very much. You know, today is a big day. It's not just 420 Day, but it is that. It is also the birth of MacStories and AppStories, and I had totally forgotten that we started this show 3 years ago today on the anniversary of MacStories itself, which is kind of cool.
It is very cool. Lots of anniversaries happening. Can't believe it's already 3. I don't know. For me, it doesn't feel like it's 11 years of MacStories.
No.
And 3 of AppStories. To me, AppStories still feels like a new show somehow, even though this is episode 159, so it's not exactly new. I don't know. I feel weird about anniversaries. It's just what it is. But I just want to say that I'm super thankful of all the people that have been listening to AppStories. We always get so many nice comments for AppStories. People like listening to the show because they discover new apps, or maybe because we talk about apps in a different, from a different angle, from the different perspective. Right. It has been, looking back at 3 years of the show, we've had some pretty awesome guests. We've done some pretty awesome interviews. We've had Craig Federighi from Apple on the show. It has been it's been quite remarkable, I think, what we've done with AppStories so far, especially because people in the Apple community always say, yeah, nobody's talking about or writing about apps anymore. A while back, I saw a tweet going around on Twitter. I think it was from Jason Fried of 37 Signals, saying something along the lines of, "What happened to app reviews?" And I didn't reply, but I was like, "Hello."
raise your hand. I'm over here.
And so I think it's pretty awesome that, we're still doing app reviews at MacStories, and we have an entire show about apps here. So
yeah, I agree. And it doesn't feel like 3 years. I do feel like this is an absolutely new project still too. All I remember about that first day was launching the show and then getting on a plane to Dublin to take my son to see Trinity College, which was I didn't have a choice really. It was just when we ended up doing the launch, but promoting the show while I was boarding an airplane to Europe doesn't seem like a good idea in retrospect, but it all worked out. And the last 3 years have been really fun. And of course, 11 years at MacStories. I am amazed that the site's been around that long. I have not been a reader since day one, Federico. I'm sorry to say that. I think I discovered MacStories probably around year 3, maybe. I don't know.
That's fine though. That's fine.
Pretty early days, but yeah, not since the very, very beginning. When it was still written also in Italian for what did you do that for? Maybe 6 months, a year?
Oh my! Why did you have to bring that up?
I just remember you had a button, didn't you? And then you clicked it and it switched over to the Italian.
There was a
version?
button. There was a button that you could. Oh my God, that was terrible. That was, and some of the Italian parts actually lingered on the website for years because I had to. After I disabled that plugin, I had to go in and manually delete the Italian blocks from those articles. Yeah, it was awful. I do not recommend it. Do not blog in Italian. Nobody reads Italian blogs. I'm sorry.
All right. Well, I have a little bit of follow-up from an earlier show, which is I wanted to just raise universal purchases again because we saw this week that GoodNotes went with a universal purchase. And one thing that's really interesting, and I think is going to really slow the initial adoption of these, is that when they did that, you can't merge 2 apps into the same app bundle. So, going into this, GoodNotes had an iOS app already, and they also had a Mac app, and they were separate, and they were paid for separately. In order to do the universal purchase, they had to create a new Mac app. It was identical to the old one, but it was technically a new SKU, a new listing inside the Mac App Store. And that became the Mac app that's associated with the iOS and iPadOS app. And I think that works fine for GoodNotes because GoodNotes is so iPad oriented to begin with. It really is at its best on an iPad with an Apple Pencil, so that the Mac app was always more, to me, at least in the way I used it, more of an adjunct where it was nice to have because I could see my notes when I was on my Mac, even if I didn't have my iPad with me, but I didn't really take notes in the Mac app. So I think that works for them because they had to kind of let go of those existing Mac users and bring them back in through this universal purchase. But that's not going to be true for a lot of other apps. And I saw, Greg Pierce, who makes drafts, and James Thompson, who has Dice on both platforms, and pCalc. I saw them kind of going back and forth and talking about it, and the makers of PDF Viewer. And that's going to be a real impediment, I think, to some of those apps that have more of a bigger presence on both platforms to begin with, to actually make that kind of move.
Right. I think it's interesting that we're now seeing all this. It's definitely one of the trends that I want to keep an eye on in terms of like having these universal purchases that allow you to have the same experience on multiple platforms. I think Apple needs to do something for this transition for existing developers, though. I think there has to be a system where a developer can switch without having to necessarily do what the GoodNotes folks did, which is release a new SKU and explain to people in the changelog for the old app what's going to happen. I think that's a terrible system to do this, to handle this. I think there has to be something from Apple that lets existing developers migrate to this new way of selling apps, because the current one just doesn't scale. You cannot ask everybody, well, just make a new SKU. Although, as I'm saying this, knowing Apple, that will probably be their answer. Just release a new SKU.
It's really a shame, though, too, because GoodNotes had a Mac app. Then when Catalyst came out, they switched over to a Catalyst app, and then they had to undo. So they already made that transition once there, although it was under the same SKU. They were an early adopter of Catalyst, and then they had to abandon that app and resubmit the same Catalyst app, and that's just a horrible. It's like a punishment for the people who are out in front pushing the technologies that Apple wants them to push, and that's not the way it ought to work.
Yeah.
This episode of AppStories is brought to you by Linode. Whether you're working on a personal project or managing your enterprise's infrastructure, Linode has the pricing, support, and scale that you need to take your project to the next level. They have 11 data centers spread throughout the world, including their latest one in Sydney, Australia. And with their enterprise-grade hardware, S3-compatible storage option, and their next-generation network, Linode delivers the performance that you expect at a surprisingly good price. Get started with Linode today with a $20 credit for listeners of this show, and you'll get access to native SSD storage, a 40-gigabit network, and industry-leading processors, a revamped cloud manager built on an open-source single-pane app, root access to your server along with API version 4 and Python CLI, Nanode plans starting as low as $5, and a whole lot more. Just go to linode.com/appstories and use the promo code AppStories2020 when creating a new Linode account, and you'll get a $20 credit towards your next project. Oh, and you know what? Linode is looking to hire right now, too. So if that's something that you're interested in, check out linode.com/careers to find out more. Again, that's linode.com/appstories and the promo code AppStories2020 for that $20 credit. Our thanks to Linode for their support of the show. All right, so today's topic is something a little different. We are going to talk about clipboard managers because clipboard managers, especially on iOS, have had a really interesting history. I mean, they've been around forever on the Mac, and we'll talk about those a little bit too. But they really jumped on the scene with iOS 8 because that's when we got widgets and extensions, share extensions, which really allowed, although clipboard managers to this day don't have the same kind of powers on iOS and iPadOS that you can have on the Mac, they became at least viable with iOS 8. But we've seen an awful lot of those kind of fall by the wayside along the way and be replaced with different approaches to dealing with things like, chunks of text or files or images or whatever you need to put somewhere else. What are some of the early clipboard managers that you tried on iOS, Federico?
Yeah, those were the days of the explosion of the clipboard manager category on the App Store when iOS 8 came out with the widgets and extensions. Despite the limitations, right, of the system that, it wasn't true then, it's not true now. we cannot have real clipboard managers on iOS and iPadOS the way that we do on the Mac, because there is no background clipboard monitoring service that developers can use. On the
Right.
Mac, you have plenty of utilities that can constantly monitor your clipboard in the background, from Alfred to Launchbar to there's folks using
Pastebot.
Pastebot and Keyboard Maestro for clipboard management. Like, there's all sorts of utilities that let you do that. That's not possible on iOS. But what was that? 6 years ago, 2014 iOS 8. Yeah, it was 6 years ago. At the time, I remember distinctly there was Clips, which was the app from the makers of. This is another app that I haven't actually used and seen in a long time. From the makers of Dispatch. So Dispatch was an email client, and also the makers of Due. Due is still quite popular. The popular reminder app.
Yep.
Released this clipboard manager called Clips, and the idea of Clips was that you had a widget that allowed you to clip stuff like text and links to an app that you could later use to see all of this, all of these little bits of text and links that you clipped in there, and you could copy them back to the clipboard. And I remember looking through these screenshots now; it's really incredible just how ugly the today widgets used to look like. But you had this translucent page where you had this quote unquote buttons. They were really like text labels with an outline around them, where you could clip a text or a URL, or the text and the URL together, and then you could open the app later and you could find those clips again. And you had a custom keyboard, which was also a new feature in iOS 8. You could use the custom keyboard to paste those clips into any text field, and you had an extension. So of course, extensions were also new, and you could also use that to save data into the app, and then you could save images. It was really quite impressive what you could do with Clips at the time. But of course, and unfortunately, this is something that has remained true to date. When we talk about clipboard managers on iOS, we don't talk about clipboard managers in the context of the Mac, where it's a true clipboard manager, where everything that you copy is accessible. And of course, it depends on just how many items you want to have in your history. It depends on the app that you're using as a clipboard manager. But as a basic truth of the situation on the Mac, as long as you hit Command-C anywhere across the system, that item is available in your clipboard manager. And that's not true on iOS, because on iOS, the act of saving that item needs to be done manually by you, either by saving text or links or images with an extension, or by using a widget, or now by using a shortcut, or by just opening the app and pressing a button or waiting for automatic clipboard detection. But it's not possible to just say, well, leave this clipboard manager running in the background on my iPhone or my iPad and it'll save stuff for me. That's not going to happen, because it's impossible. It's technically impossible.
Yeah, it's a real shame, but we still do have some pretty impressive apps, and I think what's happened is that despite the early, I guess, excitement over clipboard managers, such that they were on iOS, things have moved, especially now that we have slide over and split view, to more of a shelf system. With apps like Yoink and Gladys, and another one that you're going to talk about. I won't spoil the surprise, but. But yeah, it's become more of a shelf type of system that is used, which you could do a lot of this simply by keeping a Clips folder in the Files app, for instance, I suppose. What's nice about having a dedicated app, though, is you can get nice previews and other information and other details about each snippet that you might not be able to do in Files. And personally, I use Yoink all the time because I like both the combination of the ability to drag and drop things between it and other apps on iOS, as well as on the iPad with a keyboard. It's got incredible keyboard shortcut support, including keyboard navigation of your clips, which is something that I wrote about in Club MacStories a couple of weeks ago, because I feel like Yoink was always so good from the get-go with drag and drop that sometimes people forget, myself included, that it also has great keyboard support. And if you happen to be using a keyboard, it's really easy just to navigate around whatever you've got stored in there and copy it and then drop it somewhere else.
Yeah, Yoink is a good example of some of the features and like the evolutionary path of clipboard managers on iOS. Because rather than trying to mimic what's possible on the Mac, because again, that cannot be done. I do believe that at some point somebody tried to sort of fake their way around constantly listening to clipboard changes in the background on iOS by playing a silent track, like a silent song in the background.
The old Facebook trick.
Yeah, I do believe that somebody tried that, and of course Apple came down pretty hard on them. But yeah, so instead of trying to replicate it, developers have taken advantage of the unique features of iOS and iPadOS. So you mentioned drag and drop. So the idea of having a shelf app that you can keep running in slide over or in split view, and then you can just select text or a link or an image and drop it into the shelf app, which you're using as a clipboard manager. That's one of the different ways one of the ways that these apps differ between the Mac and iOS. And sure, you can have a similar experience on the Mac. You have Yoink, for example, and you can drop stuff into Yoink. But I think it's more, the multi-touch environment especially on the iPad, I think is more conducive to this kind of experience. And you also have rich previews, especially for links. So on iOS and iPadOS, there's a new rich link framework. It's called the Link Presentation Framework that was launched in iOS 13, and that allows developers to effectively get for free all kinds of visual previews for any kind of link, whether it's like a web link to an article on MacStories or a YouTube link or an Apple Music link or a Spotify link. Fun fact, Spotify in the upcoming 13.4.5 beta supports playable previews in iMessage. So if you send somebody a Spotify link, you can listen to a 30-second preview of a Spotify song in iMessage. So rich links are awesome, and developers are using them to support all kinds of visual previews with thumbnails for all kinds of content. And Yoink is a good example of that.
What I think is really fascinating about that app is that it started on the Mac and came to iOS, and it really, it's a beloved app on the Mac too, but I feel like it really came into its own once it had an iOS component for the reasons you just listed. And I also think that's one reason it's one of the best versions of a shelf app that you can find on iOS, because the developer was already doing something very similar with, drag and drop type functionality on the Mac. On the Mac, it sits, on the side of your screen, and you can place it on the left or right, top, bottom, wherever. And I use it all the time on my Mac, but I do find it to be even better when I'm working on my iPad.
Yeah. Yeah, Yoink is a really good example of all these different technologies that you can now use on if you want to make a clipboard manager for iPhone and iPad. So drag and drop, rich previews, files integration. So the stuff that you save in Yoink, you can also access from files. Keyboard shortcuts, which is, and also on the Mac, but on iPad, it works differently. Split view and slide over. So especially the slide over integration, it really allows you to sort of almost have a clipboard manager running at all times. You can leave it there in slide over, and then you can quickly drop stuff into it. So it's and extensions, of course, are another way that you can get stuff into Yoink. So, and there have been other apps. Before I talk about the app that I've been using lately, other apps have sort of kind of disappeared, or maybe they're not in the spotlight as much anymore. Copied was very popular. It was my absolute favorite clipboard manager for a couple of years. It had this unique feature that allowed you to script your clipped items using JavaScript. So you could have like JavaScript and regular expressions if you wanted to share or process the data in Copied in a bunch of different ways. And it was really powerful. It was available on iPhone, on the iPad, on the Mac. And then it never got updated anymore. And I honestly don't know what happened to the developer, what happened to Copied. It's a shame because it was a really powerful app. I don't think it supports the latest iPhones and iPads even. So
no, it was a very early adopter of iCloud Sync too, which made it even more powerful for people who worked across iOS and the Mac. And I like you used it for a very long time, and it had super solid sync, but it really has been neglected in the last, I don't know, 2-3 years maybe.
Yeah, I could say that back in my day, when I was an early iPad user, we used to sync or clip text with Dropbox files. So
Of course, yeah.
back in,
the buggy whip days of copy management, right?
these kids have it easy these days with their iCloud and CloudKit data. Yeah,
Their fancy iCloud sync.
fancy iClouds. Pastebot, very early example of a clipboard manager on iPhone. I don't think it was it ever on the iPad?
No, don't
maybe.
think so.
I don't know.
Well, maybe in compatibility mode, but I'm sure on compatibility
maybe.
mode. I don't remember.
Pastebot is now on the Mac though, right? And
Yeah.
do you use Pastebot on the Mac?
Yeah, I do. I go through phases. I mean, when it comes to the Mac,
We all do, John. We all.
yeah, I go through phases on clipboard managers like I do task managers, because I just like to try different ones every now and then and see what fits best. I have used Yoink consistently for a very long time. It's more of a shelf app though. For true clipboard management, I more often than not use Alfred, because Alfred has really good clipboard management built right into it, and my hands are just so used to triggering Alfred. With Pastebot, though, I've been using that more recently to try to go back and get a feel for it, and it is really good. I mean, it's a really deep app. Not only does it store all the kinds of things that we've been talking about, but you can do like sequential copying and sequential pasting, which is really good if you've got like 4 things in a row that you need to copy, and then those 4 things need to be pasted somewhere. You just copy them, Command C, Command C, Command C, or whatever, and then you paste them into the other thing in the same order, which works really well. It's got a lot of functionality, but for day-to-day use, I just keep a lot of things in the clipboard history for Alfred and just trigger it that way. I mean, you can merge things in Alfred, for instance. It's a pretty deep app. You can do a keyboard combination so that you copy if you're doing text, copy a word, then go to another sentence and do the keyboard shortcut, and that's merged into your first copy. So now you have both together, and you can define how they're separated, whether it's a space or a comma or some other carriage return, whatever it happens to be. Yeah, there's a lot you can do with Alfred, and I think Alfred's one of those apps that a lot of people start with it just to launch things, and then once you poke around, you start realizing that there's a lot going on in here, and its clipboard history is also kind of incorporated with the snippets, so that when I launch Alfred and bring up the clipboard history, right at the top are my snippets, so I can just hit return and it'll show me a list of my snippets if I want to drop something into a document that way, or I can kind of scroll down and grab something that I had copied earlier just onto the usual clipboard.
I never fully understood Alfred's workflow system, like the way that you put together workflows with Alfred. It just never clicked for me. I think it's kind of, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's kind of reminiscent of Quartz Composer, like the way that you have these nodes that you connect with each other.
Yeah, it looks a lot like that. I mean, I think that's a good description of how it works. I use fairly simple ones. I've picked up some along the way that other people have made. I've also created really simple ones that'll do things like automatically search MacStories, for instance. It just saves me having to click up in the search box on the site. But that workflow system in Alfred is something separate from the clipboard history. The two of those things are separate. Clipboard history is just kind of a built-in feature.
So the app that I want to talk about, this is I don't think I've ever mentioned this one on MacStories. I don't think we've ever covered this anywhere in any of our roundups. So the app is called AnyBuffer. So AnyBuffer comes from the developers at, if I think I'm getting this right, Amoeba Labs, maybe.
I think that's right.
They are the makers of ESSE. It's ESSE. It's a powerful text replacement utility that comes with rich shortcuts integration. It lets you modify text in a bunch of different formats. And they also make AnyBuffer. So AnyBuffer is a shelf app. It's actively developed. It's on the iPhone and the iPad, and it syncs with iCloud. And it supports all the common features for shelf apps. You can drag and drop. There's an extension. There's a button that lets you paste whatever is in your clipboard, and you can have multiple shelves. And you have these visual previews. And for each item that you paste, you can inspect, just like in Yoink, you can inspect the multiple versions of an item. So, like an image can be an image or. No, an image is not a good example. Maybe rich text can be both rich text and plain text at the same time,
right.
Because of how the drag and drop framework works on iOS. There are two unique features of AnyBuffer, and the reason why I've actually put this app on my home screen last week. So, coming from me, this will not be a surprise, but there's a feature I love, which is you can create smart shelves. So, a smart shelf is a shelf that shows you items based on specific matching criteria.
Okay.
An example. You can create a smart shelf, which is like a smart folder, basically, that says, okay, show me all items from all of my shelves that are links saved anytime. So you can put together a shelf that shows you all kinds of links that you've ever appended in the app. Or you can do things like, okay, show me images from these two specific shelves. The kind, of course, needs to be an image, and the date needs to be in the past week, for example.
So that's really nice.
So this smart shelf functionality, it's basically smart folders, but for clipped items. And I think it's genius because it simplifies management, and it simplifies just the action of finding stuff again. Especially if you want to filter by type and by date. So it becomes a very easy way to say, show me the links that I've saved in the past day. And that's super convenient. The other, actually 3 features make it stand out. The second one is the really rich and useful integration with the keyboard and the pointer in 13.4. Search is especially impressive because you can invoke search from a keyboard shortcut. And then, search results are, as soon as you start typing, you see search results appear below the search bar, and you can select them, and you can open them, and you can manage them entirely from the keyboard, or if you have a trackpad, using the pointer. And the third feature is the rich shortcuts integration, which I'm still playing around with. I haven't made any shortcuts yet. I've only taken a look at the actions and see what they do. But you can save stuff using shortcuts with parameters into AnyBuffer. And you can retrieve items, and you can create new shelves from outside AnyBuffer. So the shortcuts integration is really well done. Now, the app is not perfect because there are some, and this is maybe a silly thing, but it's something that I noticed. There are some typos in the UI, which of course is something that I notice immediately because it's my job, and it's something that could be polished a bit more. But more practically speaking, there's 2 things that I would like the developers to address. One is the fact that they have this mini sidebar that which is what contains your buttons to switch between shelves, and too often this sidebar is dismissed automatically. And I would like the sidebar to always be visible, and maybe be even a bit bigger, because it's not even a sidebar, it's like a strip of icons, whereas I would like it to be an actual sidebar with text labels. And the other, and this is more of a feature request, I would love to be able to filter when creating a smart shelf. I don't want to just filter by name, which is of course an option. You can filter items by typing some text, but that text only matches the name of an item. Whereas I would also love to match any text within a URL. So for example, I could create a shelf that showed me all items containing MacStories.net, whereas now you can only match the title of a link.
Right, and the title might just be the title of the article.
Exactly.
MacStories is not in that, right?
Exactly.
Got it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
have you tried the multiple window support in iOS 13?
It also has multiple windows. Yes. Good point. I have not tried that because I mostly keep this thing running in slide over or split
Right.
view, but it's also in there. So it's a modern experience. It's updated quite often. It comes with some real pretty custom icons, so you can alternative icons of multiple colors. So it's very nicely done. And yeah, you can automatically add your new items from the clipboard. You can automatically empty the trash daily, weekly, or never. And you can filter. Of course, the main view of the app is the inbox, and you can filter the inbox. There's a filter icon at the top of the screen, and if you tap it, you will see a way to filter by kind. So you can filter your text notes, or you can filter your links, for example, your images. So AnyBuffer is a really modern take on a shelf app that integrates with a lot of modern iOS technologies. And I'm especially impressed by the fast search and the smart shelf functionality, which I don't think any shelf app, any clipboard manager on iOS offers, honestly.
Yeah, that's one that I have not seen, and that it doesn't surprise me that you like that, because it's very much a saved search smart folder type of thing, which I know you like, and it's a great way to it's a great way to organize your things. I mean, I'm just thinking about that, like when I'm looking for links for the newsletter for Club MacStories, for instance, it'd be really easy just to filter links based on what I've saved in the last week, and then they'd all be right there when I go to write that up at the end of the week. So yeah, I'm going to give this a try. I haven't used it myself.
Yeah. So there you go. That was my surprise mention for this week's episode. And I hope the developers are listening. There's also something else that I want to quickly cover. And I don't want to make any promises, but so here's where I'm at. Simon Stowring, the developer of Scriptable and JSON, recently released this new utility, which is called Data Jar. And I haven't covered Data Jar on MacStories because unfortunately it came out right when I was working on another big shortcuts related project that I need to finish first. But Data Jar is basically another example of what developers can do with parameters in shortcuts in iOS 13. Data Jar offers data storage for shortcuts. So the idea would be that it's a simple utility that lets you store data. It can be text, can be images, can be documents, can be links. And you retrieve that data in the background using shortcuts with parameters in iOS 13. So you can keep, it's like having global variables, if you will, in shortcuts. So if you have a list of items, or if you have an image or a document that you want to retrieve every day in shortcuts, you can save it in Data Jar, and then you can retrieve it from a shortcut without having to open Data Jar every single time. And it also goes the other way around. You can save data into Data Jar from shortcuts, thanks to parameters. So I've been playing around, and I have the skeleton of these shortcuts done. I have 2 shortcuts to use Data Jar as a clipboard manager, is what I've been working on. The idea of like, what if I made my own clipboard manager? I had this idea years ago, and I had a shortcut that I think you can still find in the MacStories shortcuts archive to use text files in iCloud Drive as a very rudimentary but efficient system for having a basic clipboard manager in shortcuts. But I've been thinking, like, could I do this with Data Jar, which gives me more freedom in terms of like retrieving items and filtering items by type and saving images, which of course is not something that I can do with text files in iCloud Drive. So I've been working on that, but unfortunately, because these kinds of shortcuts take time, and I'm also working on another big one that if you're a Club MacStories member, you know what it is because you've seen the teaser from last week in the newsletter. So it's a very small teaser, but it shows you what it is. So I'm working on that, and I haven't had the time, unfortunately, to finish this Data Jar one, but it's something to keep an eye on. If you're a shortcuts user, now more than ever, it is possible to use utilities like Data Jar or like Toolbox Pro, which also offers a global variable feature to make your own clipboard manager. And of course, all existing limitations that we mentioned here on the show apply. You're still going to have to save your data manually, but it's a way to, make your own. So
yeah, no, it's a great tip. And I think with things like Data Jar and Toolbox Pro, there's a lot of opportunities for creating templating systems. And in a way, that's what a clipboard manager is. I mean, you're saving something that you want to reuse again in the future. And I've been thinking about doing this for some of the things that I do every single week on MacStories, where I can just retrieve and populate the skeleton of a document that I use, for instance, when I put this show together, that has all the different fields that I'll need to fill out the website to get the show up on appstories.net. So yeah, that's interesting. I'm looking forward to trying your shortcut at some point down the road.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it'll take me a while though. So
all right, I'll try to be patient. I'll try to
Okay.
be patient, and I'll hopefully the listeners will too. Well, Federico, I think that's probably a good place to stop for today. I want to say happy anniversary again to you and
Thank
to
you.
AppStories
You too.
and MacStories. And of course, thank you to our sponsor, Linode. We'll be back next week with another episode. You can find Federico and me on MacStories.net. Federico is on Twitter and Instagram where he's at Viticci. That's VITICCI. And I'm on both as at John Voorhees, JOHNVOORHWES. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.